Good morning, and I'm glad you're here. I know that this is an unpleasant and unpopular topic. To talk about things like loss and grief, it's hard, it's difficult. And it can be extremely difficult for some people because of what they've experienced. For you to be willing to expose yourself to these kinds of discussions and to be willing to stop and think about these kinds of experiences, I think is a real testament to you. I admire you, I appreciate you, and I hope that your time is going to be worthwhile this morning. And if you're engaged mentally, if you're engaged emotionally, I think that it can be and that it will be. I don't like to go places and preach to people. Now, I will, in our worship time, I'll preach at you. But what I'd rather do during the other times, all the other sessions, I'd just like to talk to you, and I'd like for you, on occasion, to participate with me in that discussion. Now, to start this morning, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to tell me about some memorable storm that you experienced, some sort of meteorological extreme experience that you've had. You might even think about your favorite storm. Now, we're here in East Liverpool, Ohio. We're exposed in this area to some pretty severe weather sometimes. Tell me about a time when the weather was really bad. Anybody? Will?
We were sinking off of the coast of Cape Hatteras.
Sinking off the coast of Cape Hatteras. So we're talking Navy.
Yes.
You're sinking.
Sinking.
Sinking is not a good thing. Were you in a boat?
We're going, and the Coast Guard came and saved us and towed us in.
And the Coast Guard came and saved you. Okay. You're a fortunate fella. Somebody tell me about a storm, a bad storm. Have you had any bad storms here?
We had a storm here one Wednesday evening. The roof sounded like it was coming in. We were getting hailstones out there. Everybody had hail damage out there in the parking lot.
Hailstones, severe hailstones, so loud that you could hear it hitting on the roof of a church building.
Okay. Covered. You couldn't talk. It was so loud.
Yeah.
It dented all the cars.
And dented cars. So in other words, when you come to church, now you've got to make sure your insurance premiums are paid up. Who knew? Who knew? Anybody here been in a bad storm? Anybody here been in a flood? How about a flood? When you're talking about the hill country, whether you're talking about southeast Ohio, eastern Ohio, or southeast Ohio especially, or West Virginia, if you're living in the wrong place at the worst of times, sometimes those gutter areas, those valleys can fill up, and houses can be ruined. In West Tennessee, when I was living there was a widow lady who came to our monthly widowhood fellowships, and she, on occasion, would have the river nearby her house overflow. It happened a couple of times while I was there, and actually the river came within literal spitting distance of her house. And can you imagine how upsetting that would be, not knowing what might happen? I remember there was one summer we lived in a cottage in Huron, Ohio, right up there on the lake. I was working with the church in Norwalk, Ohio, and there were some bad storms, and Lake Erie filled up. And we were living so close to the coast of Lake Erie there in that cottage in Huron that one Sunday morning, we woke up and Lake Erie was literally within a few yards of that cottage we were in. Storms can be a really scary experience. I want you to think about some that I'll bet you remember. Like Katrina was a very well-known experience for those people down in Louisiana and Mississippi. When you think about winds that are over 100 miles an hour and the damage that can be done by that. My daughter lives in Smyrna, Tennessee, and a few weeks ago there was a tornado that came across the pasture across the street to her house, jumped the street, went over her house, and into the neighborhood back behind her house. She now has a new roof. She's waiting for repairs on her gutter spouting. Her garage door is going to have to be replaced, and the 6-foot fence that she had around her backyard is going to have to be repaired because it has been blown up too at a few places. Tornadoes can do terrible things. Hurricanes can do terrible things. Buffalo, 2014, can you imagine 6 foot of snow? When we were living in Hartville, Ohio, one of the things I loved to do was shovel snow. And I would make it a point. I tried to exercise a little bit of wisdom. And when we had a snowstorm, what I would do is every couple hours, I'd go out and shovel. I love to shovel snow. I don't get to do that much now, 40 miles west of Atlanta. But I love to shovel snow. It's great exercise. And you can clad yourself with enough clothes that you can be comfortable out there. As a matter of fact, you can kind of sweat pretty severely and come in and have to get out from underneath all those clothes. But I love the snow. I love the color of snow. I like the challenge of the snow. If it snows in March, though, that's when I become a little impatient. Can you imagine, though, a storm where you had 6 foot of snow? Tornadoes can do tremendous damage. Some of you may know some people who, down in the Dayton and Xenia area years ago, went through that terrible time. And then up here in this area, in the Warren area in Trumbull County, there were pretty serious damage up in this area as well. Storms can do tremendous damage and cause people to experience a tremendous amount of destruction. There's one thing that you can say for sure about storms. What you can say for sure about storms is they are inevitable. It doesn't matter where you live. Even Hawaii, as peaceful and beautiful and as attractive as we think of living in Hawaii, they have storms too. Meteorological storms, meteorological extremes they're just bound to happen, no matter where you live. If something's inevitable in your life, what would be the best thing to do if it's inevitable? There are things like, you probably have noticed. As a matter of fact, I see enough gray hair and some bald heads here, so I figure you probably figured this out by now. Have you noticed that aging happens? It's so easy to age. All you got to do is keep breathing. If you keep breathing, it's going to happen. Aging can be a stormy experience because you start experiencing things, some pretty dramatic things, and some pretty limiting things that you've never experienced before in your life. Aging is an inevitable storm that you're going to experience. There are a lot of other kinds of storms. It's an inevitable reality. Just like Jesus said, in this world, you will have tribulation. And when James wrote about dealing with trials and turning our trials into triumphs in James chapter 1, he talked about how that these trials that we have, and when we experience them, he encouraged us to rejoice when we experience those trials. He deals with that subject in the first chapter of James chapter 1 in light of the fact that it's inevitable. He doesn't talk about it if it's going to happen, because it's a given. It's going to happen. The way he deals with it is, because it's going to happen, he says, this is how you need to look at it. This is how you need to be thinking about it. This is the kind of perspective you need to have about it. Storms of life, just like meteorological storms, are inevitable. If something is inevitable, what you ought to do is you ought to prepare for it. At the end of the Sermon on the Mount, there's a very familiar passage. I want to give you some advice that's not original with me. This is advice that came from old brother Charles Hodge, who's gone on to his reward. A very interesting speaker, one of the most unique speakers I've ever heard. His writing also is the same way. If you ever have a chance to secure any of the things that he's written, it's worth reading. He's a very interesting writer. He was a very interesting man. For years, he wrote the last page of the Gospel Advocate periodical every month. His insight and wisdom was just exceptional. He made this remark. I'll never forget two things that he said, and this is one of those two things. He said, familiar scriptures ought to be read more carefully. Familiar scriptures. You know what a lot of times happens in our Bible reading is when we get to a familiar passage, we observe the Passover. We just pass right over it because we've read that 1,000,000 times. I think Brother Hodge has good advice. Familiar scriptures ought to be read more carefully. Now, Matthew chapter 7, here's the setting. He spent time in what we call the Sermon on the Mount, doing basically two things. It's kind of like the Magna Carta of Christianity. If you want to be a Christian, your Magna Carta there is in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, where basically Jesus says two things. This is how you need to be, and this is how you need to behave. That's basically what the Sermon on the Mount is about. If you want to be a disciple of Jesus, this is the kind of person you need to be, that you need to strive to be, and this is the kind of person that ought to behave like this. So it's about being and about behavior. So he's done all these wonderful things, touching on a number of different things about life and about being the disciple of Jesus we need to be. And then he begins in verse 24 to bring his sermon to a conclusion without offering an invitation. But he offers some very thoughtful words here. Read it more carefully. Therefore, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain descended, storms. The rain descended, the floods came, the winds blew and beat on that house. But it did not fall because it was founded on the rock. But everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand, and the rain descended, storm. The rain descended, the floods came, the winds blew and beat on that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. He is not offering here architectural direction. He's finishing up his sermon by giving the admonition, now I've told you the kind of person you need to be, and I've instructed you in how you ought to behave. Now put this into practice. And if you put this into practice, you will be preparing for what inevitably are going to be the very difficult times of your life. It's not an if, it's a when. W-H-E-N. It's not a question of if you're going to experience the storms. It's just a question of when. And then how many times you're going to experience that when in your life. Some of those storms come without warning. Bang. Some of those storms you see coming. You know, the thing I like about snowstorms, besides shoveling snow, the thing I love about snowstorms is you know they're coming ahead of time. I mean, Dick Goddard, do you folks get Channel 8 in Cleveland, Fox? You might get Pittsburgh stations, but Dick Goddard, you probably heard of him. You know, he was like, for 1,000,000 years, the major forecaster, meteorologist with Fox 8 in Cleveland. He's passed on now. But everybody would turn to Dick Goddard. They could trust him. He was an old man. He'd been living forever, and he knew stuff. And so when he'd predict a storm, there was always this big rush when this snowstorm was coming. They knew they could count on Dick Goddard at least getting close, if not getting it exactly, getting it close. So everybody went to Giant Eagle to get their bread and their milk. Now, why it's always bread and milk, I don't know. But there was always a big run on bread and milk because you knew ahead of time that it was going to happen. But some of the storms, we don't know that they're going to happen ahead of time. Sometimes they just happen out of the blue. A fellow I went to school with by the name of Kenny Gibson married a lady from Dover, Ohio. Kay Waldo was her name. And after we had graduated from college together at Freed-Hardeman College at the time, they had gotten married and were living down in Georgia. And one day, she was driving down the road and was in an accident, and she was dead. Many of you know Rick Tencher and his wife, Cynthia. She was just going to the bank. I mean, how could you not go to a bank safely and then come home safely? And his world's turned upside down in a flash. You can find out that you have cancer and didn't know it. You know, sometimes when people ask me about how I feel, sometimes I respond kind of tentatively like this. I will say, well, I think I'm okay. But, you know, sometimes you're not as healthy as you think you are. Sometimes you can feel healthy, but you can actually be in the beginning stages of a very serious time in your life because you're not really healthy even though you feel like it. Storms are inevitable. Can you prepare for these severe storms that we can experience in our life? The answer, if you believe Jesus, the answer is yes. How do you do that? By listening to Him and by putting what He said into practice. That's how you prepare. Now, that doesn't mean that in a storm that you have prepared yourself for in that fashion, that's going to mean that you're not going to experience damage. In a storm, you may still experience damage. You may experience damage that you have to live with the rest of your life. But you know what a good goal is when it comes to storms? A good goal can be summarized with one word: survive. That's what the goal ought to be. If you experience a life storm, I would not even recommend you use the word or think about the word cope. I know we're inclined to use that word, but I think a better word initially, if you are experiencing a storm, all you've got to do, the minimum requirement of life, is just survive. A lot of times I say to people who've lost loved ones, very near and dear to them, just keep breathing. That's all you have to do. Don't expect much of yourself. Now, typically, I'm the kind of person where I say shoot for the sun, moon, and stars and settle for what you have to. But shoot for the sun, moon, and stars. But sometimes, there are very few times this is true, but sometimes what we need to do is shoot low. All you got to do is keep breathing. You just got to survive. And if you keep surviving, what you're going to find eventually as you're experiencing a storm, if you keep surviving day to day, and when it's really bad, hour to hour, what's going to happen is you're going to learn coping skills. Because we're resilient. We're built to be resilient. We're built to be survivors. We have the instinct, just like the lower animals in the animal kingdom, that instinctive survival spirit that we have. But we just need to keep surviving. What we're going to do is we're going to gradually learn, and it could be very gradually, we're going to learn coping skills. And you know what's really neat about going from survive to cope? Is we can eventually get to the point where we actually grow. That what has been a terrible loss that we've experienced in our life can provide for us our greatest gain. Now, I know that sounds kind of weird, but it's true. If our reaction to the storm is the way it ought to be. Navigating one storm. And that's what we need to do. We need to learn to navigate. We can't avoid all storms. I mean, we may try to, but we just cannot. It's not possible to avoid all storms. I mean, you can eat right. Now, I'm not suggesting people just eat anything, anytime, and go hog wild. But even if you were to eat right all the time, every day, I mean, you're what is a lot of times referred to as a health nut. And I don't say that in an offensive or negative sort of a way, just a descriptive sort of a way. You can eat right all the time. You can exercise every day. I have a goal this year. My goal is to walk 1,000 miles. I'm getting down there I'm pretty confident I can do that. But I'm working on walking 1,000 miles this year. One reason I do that is so I can keep eating. I figure as many calories as I burn, then I can eat that many calories and not get any fatter. But what you got to do is you got to learn to navigate things you can't avoid. Bad things are going to happen. Storms are going to come. But what happens is when you navigate a storm, that builds your confidence. It can also build your humility because it can cause you to reflect on the fact that it's the Lord that helped you do that. You didn't do it by your own might, by your abundance of wisdom. As a matter of fact, we can be terribly foolish. And our strength is nothing but weakness, actually. But God can help us to navigate our storms. And once we navigate a storm, that builds courage and strength for the next storm. When we experience the storm of loss, it does a number on us. It messes us up big time. We feel lost. We get confused. We feel unsure. Things are not as clear as they used to be. And we're just perplexed. We have a million questions, and it seems like we have zero answers. And it's so frustrating. It's not just painful. It's frustrating and it's scary. Later, in the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday sections of this particular grief and loss workshop, we're going to talk about what grief does to us and why does it do the number on us that it does. There are reasons for that. And I think us understanding those reasons helps us to be more reasonable in regard to us as we're working through some of these things that we experience. About 3 weeks after my wife passed away, she had Parkinson's disease for 8.5 years. It was a steady decline. She lasted far less time than the typical Parkinson's patient. It's not uncommon for a Parkinson's patient to last over 20 years or over 30 years. And the vast majority of times, Parkinson's does not take a person's life. It's something else. What Parkinson's does is it lessens your ability to function gradually. She had a very steep decline, so she only lasted for 8.5 years, and Parkinson's did take her life. The doctor told us 5 months before it happened. He took me aside out to the hall of Altman Hospital in Canton, and he said, look, this is not an urgent situation, but he said, what's going to happen is, he said, sometime, and he said, you don't have years, but he said, sometime in the future, this Parkinson's disease is going to go up into her respiratory system, and she's just going to stop breathing. Just like she stopped walking, stopped eating, stopped being able to move her hands or hold a grandchild. She's going to stop breathing. Well, on Christmas morning of 2013, at 9:40, that's what happened. And I watched her draw that last breath. About 3 weeks after she died, in January of 2014, I was sitting on the couch in a house where I was the only one there. And it was a cold January night. You know how dark it can seem in January. I experienced something I had never experienced before in my life, and I haven't since. I spontaneously said something that I didn't know I was even thinking about. It just kind of came out. You know how kids have no filter between their brain and their mouth, and it just kind of comes out? Well, that's kind of the way it was with me that night. And here's what I said out loud. Now, why in the world I said it out loud, I have no idea, because nobody was there to hear it. But what I said was, what's wrong with me? I was a mess. I was struggling. And I was a preacher. You know, preachers are supposed to be strong, not weak. Preachers are supposed to be good at handling these difficult times in life, and especially the experience of loss. After all, I'd been with a lot of people, pre-loss, at loss, post-loss. I had read books about death and dying and about grief. I'd never read one book about widowhood, though, until after she died. Then I had an insatiable appetite to read about that subject. But I said, what's wrong with me? I'm just glad that I'd done some preparing before that time that I really wasn't doing to help me with being left behind. I was just doing it because I was trying to be a disciple of Jesus. See, when we're really committed to being a disciple of Jesus, hearing Him, listening to Him, applying that to our life and being that right kind of person and behaving in the way that He wants us to behave, what we're doing is we're not just preparing ourselves to be left behind when somebody dies. We're also preparing for all the storms of life that we will ever experience, because that's the way to prepare for life's storms. Be a fully devoted disciple of Jesus. To love Him more than you love anybody else or anything else. And be passionately committed to have a close relationship and walk with Jesus. Now, when you're left behind, you're still going to be confused. You're still going to be perplexed. You're still going to have a boatload of questions. There's a reason for that. Again, we're going to talk about that Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Why? In a nutshell, let me simply answer the question this way at this point. You know why you grieve when you suffer loss? You're human. I still want you to come back Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. That is the short answer. Think about Jesus, described in Isaiah 53, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. There's that word, acquainted with grief. In Luke 22, when he's praying, he's agonizing in prayer. It's in agony he's praying. And remember that very descriptive way that he's praying. His sweat is like drops of blood. That's passionate praying. The time in my life that I most passionately prayed were those days after my wife passed. And I had a hard time doing that. I was such an emotional wreck. I had a hard time uttering the words because I would get so emotional, I would just have to quit. Jesus in the flesh, acquainted with grief, he knew something also about agony. Remember the sorrow that he expressed in Matthew 23? Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. He was grieving. He had done all that he had done. As a hen gathering those chickens and wanting to be protective and providing everything that was needed. And what were they doing? They were rejecting him. And he was agonizing about that. He was grieving about that. Does he know? Yes, he knows. We have an elder brother. We have a high priest. And notice the way that this is worded in Hebrews 4, verse 15. We do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize. Now, an English teacher would be somewhat critical here because this is a double negative. Okay? So, two double negatives, they kind of cross themselves out. So, the thrust of this passage, we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses. So, the point being is, we do have a high priest who can sympathize with our weaknesses. His name's Jesus. The Son of God. When he permitted himself to be incarnate, embodied in human flesh, he took on all of the weaknesses of the human flesh. And there's a bunch of them. We're experiencing them right now. We're so vulnerable in the flesh. You stop and think about the last 13 months or so. I don't describe it as strange. Bizarre is the word I use. It has just been bizarre, hasn't it? The last several months. People scared to death of this virus. I don't say that to minimize. There's legitimate concern about the virus. And churches and businesses, that we have we've tried to take precautions. And so we're doing the best we can. But we're concerned about this because we're embodied in flesh. If we were totally spirit, we wouldn't be worrying about this. But here Jesus, embodied in the flesh, he knows. He knows what it's like to be hungry. He knew what it was like in his personal ministry to be thirsty. He knew what it was like to be tired, to be exhausted. You know, whenever the storm, when him and the disciples were in the boat, and those disciples were so cranked up, scared to death about what was going to happen, you know, they had to run down, and what did they do? They woke up Jesus. He was exhausted. You know, I'm the kind of person typically, when I go to bed, I mean, there could be a tornado and I wouldn't know. Some people are gifted with the ability to just conk out. I mean, just conk out. I've never done it during a sermon, but boy, I've said sometimes you could lean me up in a corner against the wall, and if it was very long, I could probably go to sleep over there no matter what the time of day was. Jesus could be exhausted. Jesus knows about what it's like to experience these weaknesses. To be a disciple of Jesus, who is so sympathetic to our struggles, provides tremendous courage and strength. Change is inevitable. What loss is it's a forced change. Now, you don't want it, do you? What we like is gain. We don't like loss. But what loss is a forced change. Life is giving you a gift that you don't want. Now, if you're a woman and you don't like a gift you're given, what do? What would you ladies do if you were given a gift that you didn't want? What would you do with it? You re-gift it, don't you? Where might you put it if you don't want it? You decide not to re-gift it. Where might you put it? Put it in a closet somewhere. After a while, you'll forget about it. If you move 20 years later, you'll find it. You know, the problem is life sometimes gives you gifts you don't want. And you would never re-gift it. And you cannot store it away and forget about it. Loss is life's gift that we don't want, but we've got to deal with. And everybody is going to experience loss. It's just a matter of how many times and how big the losses are going to be. What happens as a result of you being forced to deal with this change of loss, what happens as a result of that, that's up to me, and that's up to you. See, change is inevitable. Growth is intentional. You've got to decide to grow through the storm that you're experiencing in life. And you can. And you know why you can? Jesus. If you're a disciple of Jesus, you're listening to Him, you're trying to be what He wants you to be, you're trying to behave like He wants you to be, that is your greatest help. To find growth in a loss. Or you might look at it this way, to gain from your loss. Crazy notion, isn't it? To gain from your loss. A Grace Disguised is a really interesting book about a man who's gone through tremendous loss in his life, but developed a very healthy perspective as a result. He said, loss provides an opportunity to take inventory of our lives, to reconsider our priorities, to determine new directions. And he goes so far as to say, deep sorrow is good for the soul. Frankly, I would like to learn without loss, without grief. And I do some. But some of the greatest things that I've learned have been through loss and because of grief. I don't like the pain. I don't like to deal with all of the consequences of loss. But the fact is, if we're intentional about this, about who we are and how we live and how we react to all this, what can happen is new opportunities open. I look at things very differently now. Very differently. Since my daughter was in the hospital at University Hospitals of Cleveland for 33 days and almost died when she was 10 years old and had 5 brain surgeries that summer. We were in an accident where a woman died in that accident. My wife got Parkinson's. I took care of her. She died. I look at things differently. I can see a lot of things much more clearly now than I ever did before. That's been my choice in regard to my loss. I want to challenge all of us. Since you can't avoid them, the best thing to do is prepare for them. You know how to do that. Jesus told us at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. Thanks for your attention this morning.